Hello and welcome back to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I could not possibly stick to a normal schedule if I tried. And I do try. Seriously, why are you laughing? Anyway, if you're not familiar with the channel just because this is your first time here, welcome and I hope you enjoy your stay. And hopefully you'll want to stick around for a bit. But just so you know what you're getting into, Zilog and Moto is a channel that I started about 4.5 years ago with the goal of collecting every English language game released for the Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD, just in case I end up hitting the lottery and can afford a copy of Syndicate, and finally the 32X. And as far as that pesky schedule thing goes, with me trying to review all 1,280 or so of the games that fall under that umbrella, as you can imagine, that's going to be a pretty lengthy task. So I'm trying to do a new one of these every week, but as stated, sometimes pesky little things like work and life get in the way. Life, such a bummer. Anyway, when I'm not up until 2 a.m. trying to patch servers for a major metropolitan entity, or frantically trying to prepare for a vacation that I know damn well is going to result in me being more tired than when I started, I'm playing games from this little library of titles here that I've built up behind me. I've still got a considerable amount of titles that I need to pick up to complete this collection, but even with just the number of games that I have right now, oftentimes I run into games that I've got scheduled to review that I know nothing about. Now, considering that a few hundred of these games are titles that weren't released in the United States, that's a pretty normal concept. I mean, why would I know about some random game that I never physically saw growing up? However, sometimes it is a game that was released here, and it's still a game that I didn't know anything about before I started collecting. Today's game is one that fits that bill, and that is Lord of the Sword. Lord of the Sword was released by Sega originally in Japan for the Master System in June of 1988, and then would be followed up with a European release in February of 1989, and then finally appearing in the United States 2 months later in April. Being that the Master System was still Sega's system of choice at that point in the United States, it was definitely an uncommon thing for Europe to get a release before the United States. So not really sure what happened there, but I'm just going to chalk that up to yet another instance of Tonka dropping the ball when it came to promoting the Master System, before Sega bought the rights back. And following along those same lines, maybe that's why I'd never heard of the game before I picked up this copy a few years back. On the surface, this looks like it has potential to be a cool game. It's got a nice cover that I'll get into in a minute. It's got a smooth name in Lord of the Sword that just rolls off the tongue. And it's apparently an adventure/role-playing game, which I enjoy, but that I've struggled to cover on the channel over the years just because of the time investment needed to give those games a thorough once-over. Case in point, yeah, that Fantasy Star review still isn't done. One of these days. So, is Lord of the Sword an interesting title that serves to break up the monotony of sports games and platformers on these consoles? Or should it have actually been called Lord of the Board, as Spacies put it so eloquently? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package. And this is my copy of Lord of the Sword for the Master System. Going along with me literally knowing nothing about this game, I also have no clue when I picked up this copy. For all I know, it's always been there, waiting for its chance to be reviewed. But seriously, this isn't a game that I went through any big, arduous search to find. I just picked it up at some point, and considering that even the North American release of the game only sells for about $30 complete, it makes sense that I was able to just pick it up at some point, as it doesn't appear to be a high-demand title. I'm not sure if that's a comment on the game's quality, or just the fact that early 1989 Master System games were still being produced in decent quantities, but I guess I'll find that out when I get to the review portion. The reason why I picked this particular game out for review this week is because I hadn't managed to pick up copies of 2 other Master System games that I've been meaning to review. So I needed to come up with a different game, and 8-Bit Boy UK had started a thread on X about favorite Master System game covers, which is where that quote from Spacies came from in a response to me posting this one. And by the way, if you're not following 8-Bit Boy UK and Spacies, definitely give them a look. But anyway, I was looking through my current Master System collection to try to come up with something that hadn't already been posted by someone else, And, by the way, to the person who posted pro wrestling, you're a sick, sick man. However, as I was looking for something with an interesting cover, I pulled out Lord of the Sword, and I do genuinely think this is some very solid cover artwork. Being that it came out in 1989, Sega had moved on to front cover artwork that was actual artwork, so none of that simplistic stuff that I just made fun of with pro wrestling. And then also, that bold black title font on white background looks pretty great. Is it my favorite Master System cover? No, probably not. But is it something that I think would sell a game to kids? Absolutely. The US version uses the same artwork as the European version, but then, as was normal at the time, the Japanese version has some different art that was slightly more manga-ish. Honestly, I don't think I have a preference here. I think they're both pretty solid covers, which is a nice change of pace to the Japanese version, usually having a much better cover. Flipping over the back, and we've got a plethora of decent-looking screenshots back here, and some pretty great flavor text as well. I especially like this one. Magical weapons may become yours for a price. Wahaha! Oh, okay, that evil laughter isn't in there, but you can just imagine it, right? One other small thing, you may not be used to seeing only English on the rear cover because of how many PAL copies of the Master System titles that I look at on the channel, but in the case of Lord of the Sword, even if this was a European copy, it would still only be in English, and the manual is identical to the US manual. Not sure why that is, but I'm thinking it might be because it's an action RPG that includes a lot of English text in the game, so they didn't feel the need to try to support multiple languages. Just a theory, but Sega did the same thing with Golden Axe Warrior, also an action RPG, so do with that what you will. Opening up the package, and I particularly like this old school Master System manual. It's all in blue and white, but has multiple screenshots and some fantastic hand-drawn artwork. Just look at this representation of the map of Balginia that's actually functional, and then 4 full pages of concept art of the various enemies in the game at the end. I love to see that. This is definitely a lost art in 2023. No pun intended. The backstory to the game is explained as well, but I'm somewhat concerned that perhaps there could have been a bit more guidance about what you have to do to make it through the game. But I guess I'll find that out when I boot it up. Which we're going to do right now. Let's get to the review. Before we get too far into the review of Lord of the Sword, in complete fairness to the game, I'd like to talk a little bit about where the action RPG genre was in general when it was released. And keep in mind, Lord of the Sword debuted in Japan on June 2nd, 1988. On the Master System at that point, there was a grand total of 0 action RPGs. Well, that's not technically true, because ironically, Kensiden was released on the same day as Lord of the Sword Japan, but previous to that, there weren't any action RPGs on the console. And yes, I suppose you could technically argue for Wonder Boy and Monsterland being an action RPG, but at least to me, that title was definitely far more action than RPG. On the Nintendo side of the house, you had Zelda and Zelda 2 already on the market, along with other titles like the original Hydlide, Deadly Towers, Faxanadu, and the original Wizards and Warriors, along with, I'm sure, possibly some other Japanese releases on the PC Engine or MSX. The whole point is, June 1988 was still pretty early as far as the action RPG genre goes, especially on Sega consoles. So when looking at Lord of the Sword, or later on Kensiden when I get to it, you kinda have to give the game a little bit of leeway, as the developers were still trying to figure the genre out. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into the game itself. One of the things that any kind of role-playing game has to get right is having a good story. And I think Lord of the Sword does that. The setup to the game is that you're a warrior named Landau who lives in the kingdom of Balginia. Unfortunately for the residents of Balginia, an evil group of monsters has killed the royal family, and with the absence of a king, they're seeking to resurrect their dark god Ra-Goan, and cause Balginia to fall into darkness. However, the elders of Balginia know of a way to install a new king of the land, which will defeat Ra-Goan's takeover, and they have chosen Landau to go out and complete the 3 tasks needed to do so. Those tasks include finding the symbol of the royal family, defeating a goblin that has taken over Balala Valley, and destroying the Statue of Evil. Personally, I think that's a pretty good setup. As much as I enjoy an RPG where there's some sort of nebulous quest at the beginning of the game, which then leads to you uncovering the plot of the game and what you have to do as you go, I also like a setup where there's definite tasks to complete, because then there's no playing with the plot or throwing in some surprise that doesn't really make sense and is clearly just done for shock value. And that's not to say that you go straight to completing the 3 objectives, as there are a few other things that you have to do on the way to complete your mission, such as fighting certain mini-bosses, but the game is still largely linear, if you want to progress through the story anyway. You start the game out in the humble town of Harfoot with just your trusty sword and bow, and you're free to explore however you like to start learning the lay of the land. Soon you'll find the next town over, Amon, and while it doesn't look much different from Harfoot, it actually ends up being the most important town in the game due to the wizard that lives there. You'll end up interacting with this wizard numerous times, but he gives you the first clue as to what you should be doing in the game by handing you a book that needs to be destroyed in order to weaken Ragoan, and then pointing you towards a nearby forest, where a tree person there might have a clue as to where you might find that symbol of the royal family that you're supposed to be looking for. Progressing through the game occurs one of 2 ways, either by completing certain tasks or by talking to individuals in the various castles or towns that dot the countryside of Balginia. For the most part, I don't mind this setup, but there's definitely a few things that probably could have been done better, and honestly reflect the fact that this was an early action RPG. Let's start with the process of talking to individuals. As mentioned, each town has someone for you to talk to, and this actually serves a dual purpose. When you talk to the people, generally speaking, they'll give you 1 or 2 messages depending on how many times you try to talk to them, with the messages sometimes being completely useless, moaning about how bad things are in Balginia, or perhaps a clue about what you might need to go do next. And then if you complete that task, or others, their responses might change. The problem is, there's no real rhyme or reason as to when you get what message. I specifically had one instance where I had to talk to a villager 5 times to get the hint as to what you had to do next. And in Lore of the Sword, these aren't just hints. Frequently, you have to hear the hint before you can go do what needs to be done, even if you already know from a previous playthrough. This is annoying, to say the least, as it would have been much easier to have just had the townspeople simply rotate all of their responses one after another, rather than basically have to berate them into giving up what they know. And, oh by the way, for the first time players, there would be no way to know if they had told you everything ahead of time. The only good thing about talking to townspeople multiple times is that each time you talk to someone, you get part of your health restored. If you talk to them after completing a certain task, like killing a boss, generally they'll return all of your health, but otherwise you have to talk to them multiple times, getting a piece of your health each time. This is actually a key game mechanic because, for the most part, this is the only way that you're going to get your health refilled and avoid dying, aside from some bosses giving you health when you defeat them. Surprise, surprise, you're not going to spend most of the game fighting bosses. It'll instead be a variety of regular enemies, and with no health potions or hearts or any other pickups, you'll spend a lot of time in the game crossing your fingers that you can get from town to town without dying, which is harder early on due to only having the starting version of your weapons. One of the other complaints about progressing through the game is some of the repetition about how the game world is constructed, which is primarily what Spacies was complaining about with his Lord of the Board joke that I mentioned in the intro. The game world is broken into rooms, with each room being connected to the right or left of one another. However, some rooms will end up having branching paths on either the left or right side, which keeps the world from being one long strip of rooms from left to right. I actually don't mind this room setup, and each room has a certain type, with some being outdoor scenes, some being in a forest, some being in a cave, in a swamp, etc. And the different types of rooms will have a specific layout of enemies to fight, with some types sharing enemies, and some types having enemies that only appear in that type. Honestly, I think the designers did a good job of connecting all the rooms together, as it keeps the environments you have to walk through varied. But ultimately, no matter the environment or the enemies you're facing, you're always doing the exact same thing, either killing the enemies or trying to avoid them, and then hoping you don't take too much damage before you can fill up again.
This is where the game can get boring, because for the most part, other than 2 shortcuts that you can unlock, you'll find yourself trudging down the same paths multiple times due to the lack of any kind of fast travel, and then killing the same enemies again and again with no reward other than points. If you know exactly where to go and what to do, it's not so bad, but chances are, unless you pull up a walkthrough right away, that's not going to be the case. We should probably talk about that whole killing of enemies thing, seeing as since this is an action RPG, that's what you're going to be doing about 98% of the time. In general, the controls for the game are relatively simple, however they also involve one of the banes of most 8-bit gamer existences, and that's the control scheme that has you jumping by pressing up on the D-pad, because the other 2 buttons on the controller are reserved for using your sword or your bow and arrow. Other than the annoying jumping, the game actually controls pretty well, and I like both the rapid-fire slashing that goes with holding forward while attacking with a sword, and the ability to pull and hold your bow to time your shots. Pair the built-in rapid slashing with a rapid-fire controller, and you'll be terrorizing even the toughest enemies, even before grabbing the upgraded swords or bows. And some of the rooms, you can rely on more brain power than brawn, because sometimes discretion is the better part of valor, and in those rooms, it's better to avoid combat than to risk taking damage. The flip side of this, though, is because the game is relatively simple, even though the controls work well, that boredom that I mentioned from having to go through the same rooms multiple times is going to get ratcheted up from fighting the same enemies in the same ways over and over again. The graphics in Lord of the Sword are a bit of a mixed bag. I like the variety of the backgrounds of the different types of rooms, and I think the enemies are well drawn, with each of them having a very individual design and no palette swaps anywhere, which is nice considering the sheer amount of different enemies. For an 8-bit game of the era, having the amount of unique enemies that Lord of the Sword has is somewhat uncommon, and even though you're going to encounter most of them a lot of times, there's enough to where you're not just going to be killing the same ones over and over again. At least if you're making progress through the game anyway. However, even though there's a variety to the backgrounds, some of them don't look particularly detailed, and the towns and castles especially appear to be very simple, with each of the houses in the towns being identical, no matter the town, and the only difference is whether the front door is open or not depending on if that's the house that you're supposed to go in. As far as the sound goes in Lord of the Sword, well, it depends on whether you're talking about the game's native PSG soundtrack or the optional FM soundtrack that can be used if you have the ability to play back the FM soundtrack from a cartridge, or using an emulator that supports FM audio. Previously on the channel, I've reviewed several of these Master System titles that have dual soundtracks, and the results have always been the same. The background music of the FM version always sounds better, but the sound effects have always inexplicably sounded worse. I'm not sure why that is, if it comes down to a lack of space for the sound samples or what, but Lord of the Sword continues that tradition, with the regular PSG background being relatively simple and repetitive, while the FM version sounds much better. But then the experiences are flipped for the sound effects. If pressed, I think I would say that I prefer the FM soundtrack, even though the sound effects are pretty abysmal, just because the background music sounds that much better. But this is one where you'd probably want to try both and see which one you prefer. Lord of the Sword was an interesting experience, and in the end, I was glad that I picked it up and played it. Is it a great game? No, I don't think so, and that's even with putting into consideration how early a title it was in the action RPG genre. I get that it's almost impossible to play it today without having 2023 goggles on, but the jumping with pressing up, while manageable, is still pretty annoying. And the in-game map that's used by pressing pause on the console doesn't actually show where you are, which kind of defeats the purpose of it being a map, and making it better to rely on the map included in the manual, assuming you have it. As mentioned, the conversations with townspeople are needlessly confusing, and for whatever reason, if you're finally able to make it to the last boss, it doesn't show that it's actually taking damage in the same way as any other boss does. So you're left with just guessing that you're actually damaging it, which is pretty inexcusable and a wonderful FU to players who spent enough time with the game to get good enough to make it to the end. As a result, I'm giving Lord of the Sword 2 stars. After playing the game, I think it's pretty understandable as to why it's not worth more on the secondary market, and I'd only recommend it to players who are fans of action RPGs and want to take a look back and play one of the forefathers of the genre.
Okay, and that was Lord of the Sword for the Master System. I'm not gonna lie, starting out playing this one was a bit rough. There was definitely a learning curve as to what the best strategies were for attacking the various different enemies, and the first time I got lost due to the fact that I knew what I needed to do, but not being able to do it because the specific clue hadn't been revealed yet, even though I had talked to that person, I wasn't exactly inclined to continue playing the game. I did get a nice sense of accomplishment from sticking with it though, and you might too, but be warned, Lord of the Sword is definitely an acquired taste. Next time on Zilog and Moto, well, just like this week, it's another game that I know nothing about. For this game, though, I've at least heard of it before because it's an arcade port for the Genesis, and I do remember seeing the name of the game in MAME. But honestly, that's about the extent of my knowledge. I don't know what type of game it is, how it's played, or even how old it is. I just know the name. Will it turn out to be a pleasant surprise? Or will it be like how Lord of the Sword was this week, where it was interesting for a while, but there's a reason it's not more well known? We shall see. Fingers crossed that it's better than a certain other arcade title that features a couple of brothers. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 214. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later!